Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, The Business Benefits of Getting Compliance Training Right. My name is Melissa, and I will be kicking things off for us today. Let's start with some introductions. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Priti Mathur, Director of Professional Services at Meridian. I would like to extend a thank you to Meridian Knowledge Solutions for sponsoring today's webinar. Powering progress with compliance training, branded and blended learning environments, and e-commerce solutions. Meridian Learning Management System addresses complex learning challenges for customers such as the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Johnson Controls, Abbott, Mazda, High Group, and the Auto Club Group. Their award-winning enterprise-level learning management platform contains their proprietary learning record store, Career Explorer, content authoring tools, and natively integrates content provided by their partner, Open Sesame. Meridian LMS is available in the cloud, on-premise, or private cloud. For more information, visit meridianks.com or follow them at meridianks on Twitter. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that our Excellence Awards Spring program is now open for submissions. We have added multiple categories this year, so please be sure to visit our website for the latest. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you have a few minutes to spare and see any topics that you would like to take a survey for, it's greatly appreciated. And all participants will receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. For the full list, please visit our main website, brandonhall.com. And finally, a few logistics. Today's presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. We encourage you to engage with us today and ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, engage in the discussion, make a comment, share your feedback, please do so by typing it into the question box on your control panel. And finally, if you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section also on your control panel. And without any further delay, I'll turn it over to David so we can dive right in.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, if you do, could you familiarize yourself with that question box? That's the way you're going to talk to Priti and myself today. If you have any questions or even any observations you'd like to make, that's how you're going to get through to us. And we'll keep an eye on those as we go throughout, try to answer any questions that come up in real time. But we will hold off a little bit of time at the end to catch up with any questions that may come in later or anything that might lead to a bigger discussion. So please feel free to use that to reach out. So just a quick heads up about what we're going to talk about today. I mean, I think clearly the topic of the day is compliance training. So we're going to look a little bit around what's going on currently. We have some new research here at Brandon Hall Group around the at least desired shift in compliance training, how it's done, how it's approached, and taking a more strategic approach to compliance training. And we'll talk a bit about what the indirect benefits and the direct benefits are of taking this kind of approach to compliance training. And of course, like I mentioned, we'll be answering some questions. And of course, Priti's here because you heard in the introduction, Meridian has vast experience working with some very high consequence organizations and industries, managing very complex compliance and regulatory environments. And so she's got a unique perspective on how this does and can work. So we're very happy to have her with us today. So to talk through what we're looking at, again, I wanted to touch on some of the research that we've recently done. But before that, what I wanted to do is do a little bit of research here today. So let's take a look. And those of you who are on the call, if you could just let us know, we're curious to know what are your current drivers for the compliance training that goes on in your organization? Right? What is it that is driving the efforts to put together and deliver these programs? And of course, you can pick one or all four or any number of these choices. If you have other thoughts that you'd like to add, you can put those in the question box to send those over and we can see those. But what's really driving your programs? Is it mostly the avoidance of financial penalties that may come from not being in compliance? Is it safety related? Some organizations have a lot more safety issues than others, certain industries. Then there's just general regulations that may not come with any sort of financial penalties or other safety issues, but they could be lawful regulations that we need to comply with. Or perhaps your organization does a lot of certification where employees can't do certain jobs unless they carry that certification, and that requires a bit of compliance training as well. So just to get a sense of the group and where we are with that. And so let me go ahead and close that poll. I think we got it all right. Representation of the group that we can look at. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up the results. You should all be seeing this now. But the biggest thing is adhering to those regulations, right? Meeting the needs of those external agencies. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, there's avoiding financial penalties, which may or may not come with those regulations that we're adhering to. Priti, this is probably a good time to jump in and say hi to everybody. When the clients that you work with, is it pretty much across the board here, or is there any one thing that's typically driving organizations when it comes to compliance?
I was going to say that these results pretty much match what we see on a day-to-day basis. Adhering to those regulations are so important. There's pretty much no industry today that is not touched by some type of regulation that they need to adhere to, and not just adhere, but prove that they have. So this lines up with what we see absolutely from our clients on a day-to-day basis. And that financial penalties coming in as a very good second makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen in our research here. So we asked a similar question to our broader survey pool. And what we found is that for most organizations, there is a heavy focus on regulatory requirements, right? So we started at that basic level of, are you trying to meet regulatory requirements? And for 42% of those we talked to, and these are organizations of all shapes and sizes and across a wide variety of industries, not just the sort of high consequence regulation heavy industries either. And 42% of them say that their compliance programs are driven by meeting regulatory requirements, full stop. That's the point of the program. Then you've got an additional 24% say, well, yes, it's meeting regulatory requirements, but we're also trying to certify employees, right? We need to have those certifications in place so that we can work with certain clients, do certain jobs, what have you. And then you've got sort of this next level, which is sort of the thing that Priti and I want to talk about, is this 34% that say, yes, of course, we're trying to meet regulatory requirements. Those, impact a wide variety of organizations, and they want to certify their employees. But additionally, compliance training is part of their overall strategy of furthering the development of their talent, which I think that's sort of the key element here. And this is what we're after and what we're talking about today, and the things that Priti works on with her clients and what we work with when we talk to organizations is trying to get beyond this check the box nature of compliance and try to get it to become more part of the culture of learning, that fabric that an organization might have. Because for many organizations, even if there's a strong learning culture in the organization, these compliance programs tend to feel like they fall outside of that. And that could be because they're managed or handled by a different group, or simply because that's just the nature of the training, is that it only lends itself to that kind of experience. And we're going to talk a little bit about why companies may want to move to the right of this diagram here. One of the other things that we found is we asked companies, just in very general terms, is your compliance training effective in reaching the outcomes that you expect of it? Now, these numbers are actually pretty good. If you look, you've got more than half of companies saying it's either very effective or extremely effective. But remember, most organizations are not exactly holding a high bar to what the effectiveness of their compliance training really is. For many organizations, and as we've just seen, the ultimate goal of compliance is just the completion of it, right? And sort of like the pass the test to show that in case something does happen in the future, we've got the records to show, well, we did do the training, so all the boxes are checked and we've done what we were supposed to do, regardless of what other outcomes might be expected from the training. So on the one hand, compliance training is seen as relatively effective, but on the other hand, we're really not holding it up to as high a standard as we may some other learning programs. Although, to be fair, in the work that I do, we've seen it that a lot of other types of learning programs that are focused on more talent and strategic ideas, they are also not measured at these high levels. There's a lot of sort of completion and smile sheet measurement going on there. So the idea here is to reframe the way we think about compliance training. And Priti, I don't know, what do you think when you work with companies? Do you find that they think that, oh, we're doing this really well, but it's because all they're really trying to do is get people through it?
I was exactly just going to piggyback on what you said right there, David, is just that, the effectiveness is measured by, we get 100% completion rate. It's not always measured by, have we lowered accidents? Have we improved the quality of the work? Have we made ourselves, have we differentiated ourselves from the industry, from the rest of the pack? Have we differentiated ourselves through this compliance training? Have we added any value to our company culture, and to the people that work here? Those aren't necessarily the effectiveness measurements that people are using. They are just looking to say, I handed that paper to the regulatory company or the regulatory board and said 100% compliance. Yeah, as you mentioned, the previous slide and this slide, that they are skewed of where they are measuring effectiveness, and if we could use this compliance training as kind of a starting point of creating company culture, and as you mentioned, what this conversation is about today is adding value through compliance training, I think we would find the numbers to be slightly towards the other side of this measurement.
Most likely, and we'll talk about some of the things to focus on there. But just along the lines of what you're saying is, we did see in that research that almost 3/4 of organizations, so 72%, said they're actively working on making compliance training more strategic to the business, right? More than a simple exercise of going through the motions and making sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. So there is definitely momentum in this direction, and I've seen this over the last few years as compliance training has finally sort of been swept up in that tailwind of where other learning programs are going, to this more personalized, contextualized, more impactful, moment of need, upskilling and reskilling type of learning, that we're starting to see that compliance training can, and in many cases should, follow that same kind of path. And so one of the things we also wanted to find out from companies is, what's keeping you from doing this very thing? And of course, when we ask any kind of question of why isn't something happening within the L&D function, you'll see that we don't have the time is typically the number one answer. I think we could all probably agree that there isn't a whole lot of time to really attack a lot of big strategic challenges that L&D faces, and there are many, obviously, especially at a time like now, as we've been through 2 years of the pandemic. This future is still slightly uncertain, and learning has been asked to do an awful lot more than it's ever done before, with an awful lot less resources, headcount, and what have you. So we see that not having the time, the fact that it's not an organizational priority, that's something that can be worked out with the business. And some of the things that we're going to talk about today are the things that you can bring to the business to try to make it an organizational priority. And I think another reason why we have Priti on the line too is that we don't have the right technology to do this, right? So we're simply just using the compliance training technology we have available, and that lets us do what we do. We can't do much more than that. So yeah, Priti.
And I was just going to say, that also comes into that next reason with the financial resources. A lot of people think that getting the right technology means that, you have to pay an arm and a leg or invest some type of time and money that we don't have, which you go back to point one, we don't have the time for it. And it's surprising that it's really not that large of an investment for a company to be able to start on this path. And, it's something you can continuously work with. So I definitely see how these kind of all hook into one another and lead one to the other.
Yeah, absolutely, and precisely that a lot of times, the idea of looking for that technology, that you're right, they get in the mindset of, well, we can't afford that. But the truth is that the point of finding the right technology is so that you're not expanding the financial resources in other ways, and you're streamlining the process so that time issue becomes less of a problem. That's always, hopefully the goal of technology. And that's why we say the right technology, not that we don't have any technology, but we're just not leveraging the right technology. So let's talk a little bit about why all this really matters, right? We've been hinting at it, we've been touching on it here and there, and I think there's a lot of avenues to discuss. But one of the first things we want to find out is from those on the call is how much of your training from your organization, the results of which need to be reported out to some external agency or agencies or some other body outside of the organization. And this is how much of all your total training that goes on within the organization. Maybe none of it needs to go external, or maybe there's more than a quarter of the training that you do needs to go. We're just trying to get a sense of how much external, I don't know if I want to use the word pressure there is, though, on how compliance is done and how it's reported.
I think that's the right word, though, David. Pressure is often what is pushing this.
It's true, and it's one of the few things where, there may be internal pressures for other learning programs, right? The business may want to know what the ROI is in some sense, but it's not the same as having some sort of external agency that has some sort of influence over the operation of the business that we have to report to. So it's interesting to see where folks are with that. And on that, I'm going to go ahead and share our results here, and let's see what we've got. So it's pretty much all over the board here. Only 11% say none needs to be external, so that probably makes your lives a little bit easier there for those 11%. But we do have 28% say it's more than a quarter of the training results need to be reported to somebody, and so that's a big undertaking, right?
Yeah, and I think also that is changing industry by industry. As I mentioned previously, there are obviously some industries like manufacturing, et cetera, that it's more obvious, but it is starting to seep into almost every industry and even every job that you could say, whether it be a certification, PMP certification, or mechanic certification, et cetera, that it's starting to come into every job field as well.
Oh, 100%. I think you see that where it was definitely people, this is part of the discussion we're having, is that there's this mindset that's attached to compliance training, this outdated sort of how it should be done and why it should be done. And it's immediately people think of, well, it's, healthcare because of all of the different, either depending on which country you're in, those countries' regulations on that, or finance, same thing. And those are the only places. But if you start to really think about it, how things have changed in the world, it's starting to seep in, like you said, in a lot of these different areas. You've got privacy issues and data rules that now make compliance apply to parts of the business that it didn't before. People need to get trained on what these rules and regulations are. That in some ways, the people that are taking this training, feel as though that it's disconnected from the work they do. They're simply being forced to comply to some rule that doesn't change necessarily how they do their job. So again, it's about changing that mindset that when something that's related to compliance training comes in, it's not looked at as this sort of externally driven, do this or else, and the only outcome we're after is the completion. Let's go ahead and hide that and jump in. So, we asked companies, a little bit deeper, right? We had that previous question about the big picture. Is it regulations? Is it certification? Is it development? We got a little more specific about what are the purposes, the more detailed purpose behind compliance training. And these are in order of what was picked in the study. So the number one thing, clearly, obviously, meeting regulatory requirements is still the main driver. And then you start to get into, avoiding mitigating risk, right? So you get into that bit of the regulatory bodies and so forth. And then you start to get into things like provide a safe work environment, which this is where things start to shift, because that could be looked at as simply, again, it's a check the box. Somebody has to take a training on how to operate machinery. As long as they've taken the training, we're good to go. But does that necessarily provide a safe work environment if you don't know that people are actually behaving the way that the training says that they should, right? So that's when you start to get into this more strategic look at compliance training. And then you look at some of the rest. Corporate citizenship. We want to drive business performance, right? Using compliance as a driver of business performance, positioning the organization to be seen as a learning-focused organization by including compliance training in this thought process, in this learning culture, you're now looked at as a more learning focused organization. Again, advancing employee development, right? So helping employees grow. Compliance training can be a big piece of that. And of course, opportunities for advancement. There are, roles that you can't advance unless you have certain certifications or meet certain requirements. So, as you go down, it's creeping in. Again, it's still very, very heavily focused on regulatory requirements. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be. Clearly, it has to be in many cases. But all of these other elements become important too, especially when you start thinking about compliance in a more strategic way. And to do that, I think it's important to think about what can be the benefits of this kind of compliance training. And so, Priti, I'd ask you to talk a little bit about some of the benefits, and we can have a little bit of discussion around this. And I know a couple of questions that came in, so I'm going to take a look at those too.
Okay, I would start that off basically with saying also it's the difference between compliance and adherence. You can comply with something, but you don't really fully embrace it and you don't really embody it. So that's sort of what that last slide shows me. As you get up to the safety and driving business practices, etc., we start getting into some of really the direct benefits of risk reduction. Risk reduction and compliance training. Although the mindset isn't necessarily that way, as you've been mentioning. So again, that top one, the direct benefit, is that regulatory requirements. You can hand your report in and say, I have 100% compliance in the training. Everyone has done it. We're good to go. But then you start looking at the other direct benefits where you start getting into culture and value add. So reporting incidents of reduction of the incidents of non-compliance. Knowledge is power. This is something that we do know, and it's a corny saying, I know it, but it in fact does change behaviors. If you don't tell someone the right way to do it or the compliant way to do this, and I think that one of the things that we often think is compliance is, a minimum of what I have to do. If you can look at it as what is the best way to be able to do this? So it's not necessarily Kaizen thinking back where you're like, oh, I have to put the broom in the corner. But no, it's that way of thinking. If I put the broom in the corner, it makes me more efficient because I can get around the room more quickly, etc. So it's changing that meaning of compliance in the person who's taking it and the people who are giving it. Yeah. And that cost, that's a big value right there. Direct benefit, something that you see again, non-compliance and legal consequences. This is something again that drives the compliance training. You don't want to be in a lawsuit. You don't want to be at the hands of something that at the hands of someone within the company who's reporting you outside. So these are direct benefits that you can see. But if you look a little bit a step behind those, they lead to the indirect benefits. So that reputation for your brand and organization, as you become more compliant and efficient and reduce violence in the workplace, probably not violence, it's not the right word, sorry, but reduce safety hazards in the workplace. You are improving the reputation internally and externally. This is something I think that some organizations don't necessarily think about, but that internal brand and reputation is just as important. Me feeling that these guys really don't care if I'm safe. They're just making me check these boxes, as opposed to seeing an attitude of safety and compliance in a caring way. Really improves that reputation and brand. And then you have, you have the people who within your organization going out and selling it every day because they're happy to wake up and come in. That customer service too, right? If you're compliant, again, this is the thinking. Am I compliant because I have to, or am I compliant because it's an efficient way of doing things? So if we can change that conversation around to say, hey, we're doing it this way because it makes us better as an organization, it improves your customer service. Okay. Yeah. It's just a different way of looking at that. And then that last one, the reduction of waste, I would say man hours are the biggest waste that you reduce. And something, I would shift that to the direct benefits almost. Yeah. You see the difference, right? If David and I are spending 25 hours trying to prep for this seminar, which is just a 1 hour, what a waste of our time, as opposed to us meeting via email and going back and forth through different technology platforms. We're able to come in and be fresh and have a conversation because we haven't heard everything that the other person is going to say during this meeting.
Right. Yeah, and these things, it's funny that when you put all these out, these indirect and direct benefits, and people who maybe have heard me use this example if you've been to one of my webinars before, but it aligns so perfectly with everything that you just said. To me, it's the idea that my example is forklift training. And I know that's not applicable to everybody on the call, clearly, but I think from an analogy standpoint, you can understand, right, as an example. So if an organization has a warehouse where people need to drive forklifts to move things around, there is forklift training to get you in compliance and certified to drive that forklift. Now, if all we're doing is providing the training, seeing that people complete it and they pass the test at the end of the training and then sending them off to the warehouse, we haven't done the job, right? Are we actually going down there and making sure that people are driving the forklifts in the way that they were trained to do so? Are people not running each other over with forklifts? Are people not smashing into the product? Are we actually looking at that? Because it does all these things. It isn't just about being in compliance. It's about being safe, which is great for your employees, directly, but then there's the cost involved with accidents and so forth, and any legal ramifications of that, damaged product, things like that. But then you get into that brand, right? Well, okay, you want the best forklift drivers. Well, who wants to work at the place where people are running each other over with forklifts? No one.
Right.
You want to work at the place that has that stellar safety record. So you're creating that internal brand. You can, that's just my small example, but it can be applied to anything. And I think the big takeaway is, and we'll probably touch again on this a few times, but is that any training program, any learning program within your organization, whatever its topic, it exists for a reason. And that reason isn't just so that people will finish it. Even the compliance training, because even though it's mandated by some external agency perhaps, or whatever it is, there is a business reason that it exists. And if you can give learners what that is, rather than take this or else, or we provide this training so we don't get sued, that's fine. I think your employees should be aware of any financial or legal ramifications of not doing it right, but also tell them why it's important to the business, right? It is, we want to drive the forklifts better for all of those reasons. Here's why it's important, how you do your job, and we become more efficient and we're better at what we do. It's making that connection that will gain that engagement and that buy-in to compliance training that's been missing for most people, right?
Now, it's one thing to read, you can read the words, but there's another thing to really understand. Yeah, I think there's an example of hearing and listening that a lot of people maybe, you can hear something, but to really listen to someone else, it takes you to a different depth, a different level of understanding. And then what you get back, the quality is very different, right? So if you are just reading a bunch of rules to someone, the quality of what you're going to get back from those people too, yes, you've checked the box, but the quality of compliance is actually going to be quite low. It's going to be the minimum. If you are explaining, as you mentioned, David, and creating that bridge for people to be like, it's not just don't run into my stuff. It is, hey, if you drive the forklift properly, you'll be done earlier in the day. You'll have met all your quotas. You'll have met your requirements, and you can log out a little early, whatever that may be. So I think it's creating that bridge and just driving just that little extra personalization. I think you mentioned earlier, David, of making this compliance something like, hey, how can I assist?
Yes.
How can I make this something that I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And so, talking about all of this strategic approach and this, the idea of thinking things this way, kind of coming back to reality for a minute here, is that one of the things we asked about was, are you providing any sort of incentives for compliance training? And we asked for things like, are you giving points and badges, or is there some sort of social recognition that, hey, so-and-so has completed this training, or does it result in any promotions? What you'll see here is, and I'm not saying that other programs have a lot of this either, but there you see more use of things like points and badges and promotions and advancements in other learning programs, obviously. But what you see here is a lot of stick and very little carrot, right? The training incentives are, you will avoid punishment if you do this, or nothing, right? 49% say there is no incentive. So we've already, coming out of the gate, haven't really put much thought into what is the intrinsic or extrinsic motivator for people to take this compliance training. And I think that's the key. We talk about engaging learning experiences all the time, and it's something we're after. How do we make compliance training more engaging? And there's idea of using new technologies and making it more interesting in colors and video and other interactivity. But the reality is, if you don't create the engagement before they even open the program, before they even join the class, there's a level of engagement that can be created by providing people the understanding of this is what's in it for you, right? It's the what's in it for me factor, and it goes very strongly for compliance, especially because it's already got a bad reputation. So learners need to understand what is in it for me from an individual perspective.
Yeah, and it's an interesting way to frame that too, David, because it's not only what is in it for you, but because of what is in it for you, it makes us all better. At the end of the day, it makes us all better. And I think that that's not necessarily what is out there. As you mentioned, it is punitive. It's basically what's in it is that we're going to get sued. What type of an incentive is that? But again, if you could make this compliance training kind of the foundation of your culture, or I guess what I want to say is like a skill set. These are table stakes. This is what you need to do to just get that job. How do you take these basic compliance measurements and move it up a level so that you are flourishing at the job, so you have a promotion, so that you have that recognition? Well, as people, we are all quite self-driven. You do want to get that something out of it. As much as we like to think, oh, if everyone's good, then we're good. It's a mix of the two.
Yeah, I mean, and just because there is an element inherent in compliance training that says doing this right does avoid bad things happening, that's fine. That doesn't have to be the only driver. People don't tend to get very engaged in things that they're doing simply to keep bad things from happening. There's got to be more about what good things am I creating by doing this as well.
Actually, one of the clients that I do work with, sorry, I just had an example pop into my head. One of the clients that I do work with, actually, the way that they do this is they work in the justice system, so prisons, etc., detention centers. So the way that they show their results actually is the reduction of violence. So they actually praise the teams. They're like, hey, these guys have, this reduced violence. They've gotten more compliance from the detainees, the prisoners, et cetera, that are in the complex. And they show the positive results of their team having completed the compliance, because again, like I said, it's the first piece of making your skill set really shine. So the way that they measure their effectiveness is not just that I finished it, but have I applied these building blocks in my day-to-day, and look at these results that I have. So it's a very different way of encouraging the other teams, because hey, Priti's team is like killing it over here. She's got this great, they come into work and such a low argument rate, such a low turnover rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dave's gonna be, I think I want to do this too. Get my team in line like that. That's a work environment that you want to be part of.
Yeah, and it's the kind of principle that we've been talking about applying to regular other learning programs, which again, in my experience, organizations still aren't even really that good at doing that. Is as beyond measuring whether or not people took the training and whether or not they liked it. Are the things that are supposed to happen happening after the training? And I would say arguably it's more important to measure and track that these compliance issues, those behaviors, that performance is happening after the training, rather than just measuring that it's occurred.
Very much agree.
Yeah, and so that kind of gets into this, right? So we asked, okay, what are some of the things that companies are doing to make compliance training more strategic? And here's just what we were just talking about, right? It's, well, let's improve the link between this training and the business performance outcomes. How does this training help the business to perform better? How does this training link directly to my specific business unit or my functional area, whatever part within the organization that I work with? How does this training link directly to my individual performance, right? And then things like the personal and professional development of employees, going back to that idea of corporate citizenship, right? If we're ticking all these boxes, we're doing it because we're trying to do the right thing, not just because we have to. And then, of course, it'd be greater to see this doing more, but rewarding, recognizing, and advancing employees, using the compliance training to say, job well done, you've met these requirements, you're doing the things you're supposed to, here's, what you get in return, whatever that may be. It doesn't have to be full on, cash rewards, but some sort of recognition that says, and what that does is there's that motivator that gives the learner something, but it also shows the organization's commitment to this, right? That we're doing this because it's important to us as a business, and we're going to demonstrate that by providing you with some sort of reward or recognition. So we're seeing that that's a pretty decent motivator as well. Before I go to the next, I was going to say, Priti, anybody that you work with, anything when they talk about this stuff, do these links exist?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to give an interesting example of a medical company
Okay.
where they were able to get, the compliance rate. How do you use the medical equipment? Okay, that's compliance training. You need to know how to use something. But what they were finding actually is that then the people that were going through the training were becoming more efficient with the equipment, and their patients were having a better experience. But there was a level of comfort, again, with the patient and the medical professional, because that person wasn't stumbling or pressing a button again or pulling out a manual once again. So it really led to more sales, which was a surprising outcome at the end of the day. But by making that link to performance, by again and again letting the people who are receiving this training at the end of the day, you will be a better practitioner. By going through this, it will make your day easier. You'll feel more confident as you walk into a room and work with this equipment. It really just changed the tone of the way that the medical equipment was being sold, and also just the success rates. Now, a lot of times I don't know if anyone is on this call in medical equipment, but there are new equipment that comes out every, now and again that just doesn't take off because there is not an understanding of the benefit. So they made this compliance training really be about the benefits that the patients would see and that the physicians or medical personnel would see. So that changed the vibe, if you will, of the way that people were taking that training, and really improved their overall sales numbers. So there are so many examples of this type of just a small bit of link where you're saying, okay, this is going to help you become a better employee. This is going to make you be a better corporate citizen. This is going to make you again, just being able to say, hey, your 9 to 5 is going to go by much faster. If you're doing these items, it's incentivizing to people.
Yeah. When you mentioned healthcare, it brings me to mind an anecdote that I have. I've done different projects where I've gone in to talk to different healthcare organizations about some of our research and walk through training and so forth. And one of the things I hear all the time is one of the biggest challenges in healthcare organizations, especially patient care, is a compliance issue. And it blows my mind that this is their biggest challenge. I hear it over and over again. It's hand washing. They have the hardest time getting people to comply with hand washing standards, the employees. And so in your mind, you think this is the simplest thing. But the problem they were finding is that all they were doing is saying, hey, wash your hands, do it this way. And without any sort of context, any follow-up. And I know that these are healthcare professionals for the most part. They should understand all this stuff, but they found that as they said, look, if we do this right, our patient outcomes become this, our bed use becomes this, our turnover rate becomes this, because people are getting sick again, or they're not getting new diseases or something else. But by providing the context around the hand washing, they would see the compliance get much better, as opposed to just putting a sign in the bathroom. So it from top to bottom, this all applies.
It's also just that reminder, right? Like when you're able to give the value add in whatever you're teaching, whether it be, as you mentioned, right, something simple that you think a healthcare provider, this is what they've done, they've gone through all these courses about sanitation or whatever. But that reminder and that value add, again, it just changes the tone of what you're receiving and how you implement it.
Yeah, and so talking about like what goes into the training, we asked what's going into your design and delivery of compliance training. And now I've got these broken out into two groups. The blue is we call others because we compare them to the yellow, which is our HIPOs, which is short for high performing organizations. And those are companies where their key performance indicators, things like revenue, profitability, market share, customer satisfaction, those are all high and improving, as opposed to the others where they may be struggling in some or all areas. And we tried to see if those groups were doing anything differently. And we can see that in every case, high performers are more likely to do these things within the context of compliance training. So the first is the very thing that Priti and I were talking about. This is the number one thing, is the contextualization of content based on learner requirements. So understanding who the learner is, what they need, what they already know, which I think is a key element that doesn't get addressed often enough, is part of creating that experience so that the learner knows, okay, I know what's in it for me and I know how that relates to the business. We do see that they're more likely to provide translation and localization, which also seems like it should be table stakes, but doesn't happen nearly enough. But that goes into the contextualization piece. And plus, if you want compliance to actually happen, making sure that it's in the right language for the right location is going to be critical, I would say. The ability to practice and apply the training in a safe environment, very critical for a lot of different kind of compliance training, hazardous environments and things like that. Being able to actually practice the new behavior without risk to yourself or anyone else, or even risk to the business in some cases, to make sure that you really do get it. Making the training more mobile, like so you're allowed to do some of it on a mobile device or when you can. Going back to that first part, the ability to test out a training. So if I can show, demonstrate that I have this, understand this concept or this behavior, I don't have to take the training again. Again, this is another big complaint against compliance training. Much of it is redundant because it's sort of it's looked at as an onboarding thing. It's done at the front end of a lot of roles where people may be coming from different places, have different levels of knowledge. And so you're either overwhelming somebody who's not prepared or boring somebody who has already been through all of this. But you can see some of the others. We don't have to walk through all of them. I'm seeing an increase in things like interactivity training, especially around augmented and virtual reality, especially for compliance training. When you start to get into safety issues, using those VR tools is becoming very popular. I've seen demonstrations of high-rise construction training done through a VR. They're actually using it not only to train, but they're weeding out candidates. So if they can't do it in the VR, they know they don't need to spend their money and the time to train them in real life on top of a building because they're never going to go up there.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah. So there's a lot of opportunities. And the thing is, these are all things that we're seeing explode in other training programs, other learning programs. And again, it comes back to that disconnect of why is compliance training looked at as a different animal than other programs. And again, it's because a lot of it is driven by external forces. So it's thought of differently. It may be owned by a different part of the business, which can be challenging. And clearly there are some compliance regulatory issues that aren't going to change anytime soon, simply because not only are the requirements driven externally, but the training itself may even be driven externally, right? Like, so, as a learning research analyst, I'm very much moving towards this, new way of thinking about learning, but much compliance training is still measured in hours, right? How many hours did someone sit in a chair and do this? In my mind, that's not a great measurement of learning, but a lot of times that's out of the organization's hand because somebody else has put those in. So maybe eventually that stuff will change, but where it can, I think we're starting to see a lot of movement and things starting to move. Do you see any of this stuff? I mean, obviously the technology that Meridian provides enables most, if not all of this, but
yes.
What do you see as far as like uptake? What are some of the things that you're seeing with the clients that you work with?
So one of the things, obviously, with everything that's happening with the pandemic is that virtual. So having the virtual connect is something that is really important, and that mobile friendly. I think that those two actually are the two that are really popping to the top. One of the questions that came up is how do we change the mindset? And that first one, that contextualization, that is how you change the mindset, where you don't just read the rules, but you explain to them why. And I think that that's why the mobile as well as the virtual compliance training really helps, because it's something like this. You have a conversation with someone and they can ask the questions that they need to understand, how is this relevant to me? And it takes away that aspect of boring, checking the box, reading all the things that I have to read because I have to read them. And it makes it interactive. It makes it real. And again, it contextualizes it for yourself. It's amazing when you hear someone speaking about something, how if you're sitting there and you're, again, not just hearing, but you're listening, you are going through the examples in your own mind. I'm pretty certain that during this webinar, some of you have been thinking back and be like, oh, we do that. Oh, we don't do that. It's always a conversation, even if just you and I are the ones that are off mute. There is that conversation mentally happening with each one, like a yes, yes, no, no. Yeah, I agree. I don't agree.
Right.
So bringing that out is what we're really seeing. So it's not about the colors that you put in your videos or whatever, but it's bringing out that polling that we just did, so that you have that participation and that thought process on the other side. Otherwise it's just watching an old rerun of a sitcom that you watched 500 times. Doesn't bring any value, and it doesn't make the mind go. So I think that that's probably the biggest thing that we're seeing a shift to for the mobile, and the contextualization is just that virtual somebody being there, making your mind kind of run through, I see why this is relevant.
Yeah. And to that question, that changing the mindset, but still ensuring we meet requirements. So the idea is, okay, as long as you can still demonstrate compliance to whoever's requiring it, whatever you're using to demonstrate compliance, as long as you can still do that, what does it matter what happens in the middle, right? Like if it was a mobile app, if it was an in-person class, if it was an e-learning module, if it was a video or a series of videos, why does it matter what happens in that box if you're still able to demonstrate? And again, except for the example that I gave before, where the requirement is that somebody sits in a chair for 30 hours total,
right?
Then if that's the requirement, well, then that's the requirement. But if that's not it, if the requirement is this person has to pass an assessment and demonstrate their skill or knowledge or behavior, what does it matter how that is delivered? And that's when we start to break open this compliance myth of, well, we could probably do this differently. When we're seeing it, banks are doing a lot of really great cutting edge learning technology stuff. Aerospace, for years, pilots and the pilots push for this, where they're able to take an iPad and do a lot of their training in this weird downtime that they have between flights without having to go sit in a class. This is something that I've heard of before. We can't put that training on a mobile device. We can't leave you to your own. But they're realizing, no, this is what the learners want. We're getting the results. It's actually better. And we're seeing it time and time again in these companies and industries where you would think, oh, you can't change this because it's, so set in stone. They're the ones that are actually trying to push this stuff forward. So it can be done for sure.
Well, something also interesting with that is that it's the conceptualization after the training is done as well. So I think that that's something that we have mentioned, but that's really where those high performing organizations take off. Like you said, the pilots and even like manufacturing, it's looking afterwards. There is a healthcare group that they actually send these post tests and post surveys with questions like, how often do you use the training? What are the points that still stick with you? So it's not just testing them knowledge wise, but it's actually testing the retention and the applicability of what they're doing. So if regulations need to change because it's not applicable, let's have that data and be able to say, hey, regulation board, you're making my guys sit there for 30 hours. It doesn't have anything to do with their real life.
Right. Yeah. And then this material here that we're looking at just, kind of backs up the things that Priti and I have already been saying. These are the biggest things when we ask companies, how important are these elements to compliance training? These two came up. Highly personalized, and that we're leveraging learning methodologies, things like neuroscience, cognitive science principles, what makes learning sticky, giving people spaced learning, a chance to revisit, refresh, practice, those elements, so still on the low side, but these are the highest ones, and they're pretty high, 41%, 42% as far as being considered highly important or critical to compliance training. So, we're seeing this move that these things are important. This can't just be a rote by the numbers, go through the motions exercise, right? So we're employing this personalization and the idea around what makes learning engaging and sticky and impactful. The other thing that we found is, what are learners provided when it comes to the compliance programs. And so these are the higher elements that we saw, that the learners were given what those behaviors should be, right, that demonstrate their ability to do the thing, right? So that's what we've been talking about, isn't just take the test, it's, okay, here are the things that you should be able to do, and someone else can see that happening and know that, yes, this has worked. So those are, and then there's the observable behaviors, post-training, and then, are you developing the specific skills of the training, giving that to learners, and then and competencies as well. That gets tricky because some organizations, they don't differentiate between skills and competencies, and they have different meanings, but we opened up that particular question to let people answer it the way it made the most sense for them. But before we get into any some of the questions that have come in that we saw, I just wanted to drop in some of the things that we saw in our research that we think are the keys. And I think we touched on all of these, but the idea that providing the context around the compliance training, what's in it for me, widening the variety of tools that we're using. Don't just make everything the same kind of experience. I think the pandemic has shown us we can survive in a world without in-person learning. I'm not saying that it should never come back. It clearly should, but maybe it should look different when we do it in the future. And we can use a lot of different tools around that. I think the same is true for compliance training. Mentioned those sort of neuro and cognitive science principles, being able to apply those to compliance as well, because you're still asking people to learn something. Why should their approach to learning that be any different than something else, like some sort of technical skill or soft skill that you're trying to impart? Recognizing people for their achievements in compliance training, not just letting them breathe easy, knowing that they've done it by the deadline, right? There maybe needs to be more involved than that. And of course, the measurement, using a variety of outcomes to measure what's going on, not just the completions, but the behaviors, the changes that affect the business, right? We've had less incidents, less accidents, less lawsuits, whatever it may be, all of those elements. And to me, the biggest thing in all of this is when you think about compliance training, you are already, no matter what, you are asking that time of your employees, right? You have to take this training, it's compliance training. So we're going to ask that time of you. Why shouldn't we maximize what we're doing with that time? Why should it just be an exercise of sitting there, clicking through pages, answering questions, and being done with it? Why aren't we taking the same approach that we would take with any other kind of learning program and trying to engage people and draw them out and find out where the strengths and weaknesses are, how this applies to even their career path and places they may go? We're already investing the time, both from the L&D professional side of either buying or creating and delivering the material. We're asking the time of the learner for being there to do it. We're asking the time of the business because, right, we're taking people, quote unquote, away from the job to do it. Why aren't we maximizing that time? Because it's at the end of the day, it's all the same time, right? Anything that you wanted to sort of touch on, Priti, before we answer some of the questions that came in?
No, I think that's a great recap. That absolutely touched on all the big points. Thanks.
Yeah. So one of the things that came in is that this Liz was actually talking about, they do a lot of robust training for compliance, and so making sure that it's relevant and applicable to people's jobs, and they do it in both e-learning as well as virtual training programs. So that brings me, and that's great to hear, Liz. That brings me to the question for you, Priti, is over the last 2 years, which I think we're all well aware of what's been going on. What have you seen specifically from a compliance standpoint? Like, what has been the impact? Because I from my own research, we know that most learning programs outside of compliance were in-person instructor-led training, but we find that within compliance, that tended to be even more so true. So what's been the sort of uptake? Yeah,
I think there was definitely some panic because, as you mentioned, it was a lot of in-person, here's the chair, here's this type of hands-on, that mentality was there. But I think it's actually just become so robust because the e-learning modules are really prepping and giving more examples, are able to reach learners in a much different manner, where when you're talking, you're really just giving the same rote example time and time again. With e-learning, they've found that they can create modules that really are honed into the learner themselves and how they will be applying the skill. or the regulation as it may be. And even with virtual, it's been different because again, you may not be in the same place with that person. So what are they truly working with? It's given these trainers a chance to see, oh, okay, well, David's in a different location. So do you have these widgets? Do you have this, or do you, whatever it may be that I'm training, and you come back and you show me something different. It changes the way that the instructor has to lead it, rather than just, you come to my training facility, I show you how it's done, this is it, and it's set in stone. So it's become a lot more relevant by going virtual and through e-learning, which I think was surprising to many of these companies out there, that they just didn't understand that it could be done in that way and have a better retention rate.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a challenge for me in terms of talking to companies over the last 2 years, because I hate to look at what's been going on as an opportunity, but for learning, it has been, if we really want to get down to it, that many organizations have been trying to do these kinds of things. They wanted to, they talk about it. I mean, we talk to them all the time about different modalities and technologies, but it's just been hard to get the inertia to, and to move ahead on these things. And then the pandemic happens, and it's suddenly, well, if you weren't already trying to think of alternatives to in-person learning, start now. And
I think it goes back, David, actually to one of the earlier slides that you said, that the reasoning is that we don't have the time, or we don't know how, and people had to figure out how.
Yeah, no, 100%. And one anecdote I have too around this, in that specific scenario, is there's a type of training that's working on machines, like actually fixing the machines, and so very hands-on. And when the pandemic hit, they said, well, we can't, how do we train people to turn wrenches on these machines? We can't do it. And the trainers themselves said, look, I think I know what to do. And they started getting cameras, and they got multiple cameras and set them up and pointed them at the machines and worked on them and showed all the steps. And the learner said, you know what, this is better than the in-person, because I could see everything because of the camera angles, and I could hear everything because your voice was recorded. I could back up if I needed to. And they actually found that was better, and they were better prepared when they did have to physically come in and show that they could physically work on the machine. So, things that companies were afraid to maybe try and thought it was not doable because everything's just too hands-on. It's not the case. There's a lot of alternatives for sure.
And I think that it ends up being more hands-on when, like you mentioned, David, like I can back it up a little bit and just see exactly what that wrench placement was, and oh, I see now what I'm doing wrong, and it allows the learner that individuality that you were talking about, to be able to see from their point of view what is happening and to practice along. A lot of times those hands-on were hands-on for the instructor, but everyone else is sitting and taking notes. And then has hands-on time afterwards, which just isn't the same. This is a lot more interactive, surprisingly so.
Yeah, no, it's very true. And honestly, from a practical standpoint, these different kinds of training provide you with much more data as they go. The people interacting with the material provide so much more data for the organization about how people are interacting with the learning, what's working, what isn't, than having people all in a room all the time.
And actually, that's a great point, David. The technology does allow now, you can literally see where you're losing people. So where do they start dropping off? Where do they just start getting lost? And because of the interaction that they have to have personally with the e-learning module or the virtual training. So that has been really enlightening for a lot of companies, because they didn't get that nitty-gritty data previously.
Yeah, and Sean comes up with an observation here that compliance training is often a direct consequence of the company culture, right? Especially the director's attitude towards it as a cost or benefit. And he mentions having a compliance KPI would be very beneficial, and I think that's true. And helping to align the overall learning strategy with the overall business strategy. If there is a compliance key performance indicator within that business strategy, then learning can build that into the learning strategy and start to align those things. And we saw how effective that alignment can be for doing this. So yeah, I think that's a great point to make, Sean. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we've managed to touch on everything. The last thing, I guess, Liz was mentioning that one of the things that is missing probably in compliance training is robust case studies and storytelling, I believe, is what you're mentioning here. And I think that's true. Anytime, it goes back to relevancy, right? Anytime we can make the training more relevant, you're going to gain engagement and you're going to get better outcomes.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I appreciate your time today, Priti. I appreciate bringing your insights and your experience working in this field for sure. It's very important to me. Thank you, everybody, for spending the time with us, and of course, thanks to Meridian Knowledge Solutions for giving us the hour and giving us Priti as well.
Thanks for the time. I really enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to hearing the responses and seeing how we can make this change even quicker.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.